All right, good morning, everyone. It's the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. It seems like we still have some people trickling in. Thank you for joining us for the last of the Working Group 1 breakout sessions. So today's task is to kind of review what we've discussed over the last 2.5 days. And then consolidate around ideas to go into the conference statement and our asks to both the Arctic Science Ministerial and then recommendations back to SAON. So could our chat monitor, I believe that's Sophie, give us the abbreviated version of our standard intro script? I believe all of us have been on a number of these calls at this point.
Sure. Hiya. So good afternoon, I guess, good morning to most people, everyone. The circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working or reside in the Arctic, we recognize these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homeland of the indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of the indigenous peoples and cultures with which we engage. With that in mind, let us engage in open-minded community-building collaboration as described in the ASSW Code of Conduct, which will be shared in the chat window. Some logistics before we start the presentation. You joined with your camera and audio muted, camera off and audio muted. If you unmute yourself at any time, please remember to re-mute after speaking. If you are connected using your phone, press 6 if your phone does not have a dedicated muting button. Please keep your phone muted during the presentation and do not put us on hold. Please mute yourself as we can hear all conversations in the background, and holding may disrupt the presentation. To avoid the echo, if you have the option, please use headphones or a headset. If you're on the phone, please turn your speakers all the way down, as we can get an echo when that your phone picks up on your computer audio. See your controls by hovering over the bottom of the screen if you're connected on a computer. You can see the chat and other participants via these controls. If you have a question, type your question into the chat window and they will be read aloud. If you need help, message the moderator via the chat tool or raise your hand using the raise hand tool. If you want to join the discussion, unmute yourself and speak up, or raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you. Or you can send a chat message to the group under everyone and the moderator will read the question aloud. For folks without mics, just type your question into the chat and it will be read aloud. This presentation will be recorded. A video file, audio file, and slides and relevant links will all be available on the agenda tab of the AOS website. I will now pass it off to the moderator to do introduction and welcome the speakers.
You would think after 14 hours of these, I would learn to unmute myself. So I went ahead and posted the link to this agenda document. It's the same agenda document that we've been using for these sessions the whole time. But we've gone ahead and added the notes that we have summarizing our meeting recap to this. So if you want to pull it up and follow along on your own, you're welcome to do so. It should be view only for all of you, so you have to suggest suggestions out loud rather than just typing them in. So the first point on our agenda for this morning is to review kind of the planned Arctic Observing Summit outcomes and what we're trying to produce out of today's meeting and then moving forward. So the first thing and kind of the most urgent thing are identifying some key points. Sorry, actually, before I start with this, I do want to reiterate that this is the same session that was run last night at I think it was like 21 to 24 UTC. So if you were on that session and feel like your points were made and your feedback was incorporated, you don't necessarily need to be on this one as well. But for those of you who are looking at this fresh, we have kind of three things that we're intending for outputs from this meeting. The first is our conference statement, and this is the basis, and with very minor tweaking, going to be the statement to the Arctic Science Ministerial in the fall. For this, we really need to think about prioritization and kind of what are our most important points we're going to make. The entire document is limited to 2 pages, so we really do need to distill things down to the most urgent and the biggest asks. The next step would be the conference report, and this is meant to be more of a kind of broad representation of what was discussed, what was included, and this is where we make our more detailed recommendations towards SAON and the roads process. This is also somewhere where we need a lot of input. We need kind of community support and buy-in, and make sure that we're representing fairly the concerns and the position of everyone who's been involved. And finally, we do want to identify next steps and how to move this forward. Traditionally, the Arctic Observing Summit has been a meeting in person every 2 years. Obviously, now we're messing with the in-person part. And we don't really intend to change the structure of the every other year kind of bigger meeting. But what has happened over the last few years is that there's been increasing amounts of work going on behind the scenes and within the AOS community offline. We think that there is, or the discussion last night was that it seems like there is some opportunity to expand that out and to be a little bit more transparent and inclusive with the off-year activity. And so identifying what there is some demand for and what people might want to engage and how people might want to engage with the process in between these meetings would be a valuable next step. Are there any questions at that point? And again, you're welcome to either write them in the chat box, just unmute yourself and speak out loud, or you can use the raise your hand button. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go through our list of highlights or kind of key points from these previous discussions. I'll go through the full list, and then I hope we can go back and take a look at a few of these at a time to really make sure they do reflect the understanding that came out of this meeting. So the first point, is that existing observing systems, things like GOOSE and some of the WMO programs, do a lot of things very well when it comes to organizing observation. And for discipline-specific products, we really don't need to reinvent anything. Instead, the value, and this is identified as really the key point last night, the value of Arctic observing systems and a key outcome of roads would be in the cross-sector and cross-discipline information and requirements sharing. So from this, we can say that an essential Arctic variable would be a concept that is both important to multiple sectors and stakeholder groups. The key part is that it's broadly impactful, and so perhaps essential Arctic variables might be better named shared Arctic variables. We identified a number of potential criteria for gauging the importance and the maturity of an essential Arctic variable. The first being that there is some sort of predictive potential or forecasting ability as an indicator, or the forecasting ability. The second point, and these are a set of ors, not ands, is that this variable is relevant for local or regional information needs and has some sort of impact on decision-making and planning. Third, that it is representative of key elements of the Arctic social environmental systems, or there are some additional others in the notes that were deemed kind of less big and important, but that these three were really the key criteria. One way that this shared variable concept would be really useful is if we can have a mechanism for different use communities to propose observable or measurement pairings, so that there are recommended additional measurements to make sure, or that would increase the potential utility of any one measurement campaign in being able to create data of the relevant sorts for other projects and other communities. A particularly important part of these global efforts is standards on measurement procedures. Implementing standards like this would be really valuable in the Arctic. Sorry, my alarm is going off. So a particularly important part would be implementing these standards, but we recognize that standards across the Arctic, given the range of different types of observations that are being made of even single variables, would be very difficult. And we don't necessarily have a sufficient market for an equivalent to, say, an Argo float. Instead, we're recommending types of observations. So for a given variable, there might be a couple of different sets of standards based on how it's being measured. These standards would be both in measurement guidelines and a set of recommended supplemental measurements that would give some guidance on how and what things should be measured in any given situation. And this recommendation comes partly out of the Food Security Working Group, recognizing that especially in Indigenous communities, every piece is integrated, every piece has to work together. And so recognizing the importance of context and this integrated observing it should be reflected in our model. Finally, these essential or shared Arctic variables and the standards and recommended pairings to go with them should be defined by expert panels, which need to be broadly inclusive and include several rounds of community comment and reflection in order to best reflect a range of perspectives and user groups in the Arctic. Arctic Indigenous community collaboration throughout the process, including participation by and crossover with the Food Security Working Group, is critical for success in this. And we identified last night that regionality and a local focus might be a key starting point. And so something we do want to talk about in this session, there was a lot of interest in starting with a Bering Sea regional group, but recognizing that the Barents Sea also has a very active research community and might be a good parallel. So existing groups, including the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, various Indigenous observers and users, global programs, and one or two other groups might be able to then start working on filling in some of the level of detail we need to move this forward. We see a real opportunity for a need for continued capacity building in Arctic communities, especially with regards to data collection, fieldwork, and local management and direction of research programs. An important question then being, how do we fund additional jobs and training to make opportunities in these communities? And then finally, the recognition that language is a real barrier in this process. We have both the opportunity to build shared vocabulary, as has been discussed in the data working groups, but also recognizing that part of the issue is that we just need to take some extra time, explain, ask for clarification where we need to. So let's go through these lists, maybe 2 or 3 at a time. So let's think about the first 3 here. Does anyone have comments on any of these points? And go ahead and just speak up. I think we've got, we're up to 16 on the call, which should be totally manageable just as a regular conversation.
Alice, this is Brian Duncan. I have just one comment, and I apologize. I was not able to make any of the meeting yesterday, so I may be misspeaking here. But on the day before that, I presented in one of the poster sessions a recent paper that 40 authors put together about satellite observing systems and what we need going forward. And one of the conclusions that we had, and I've seen this conclusion expressed by others in different documents over over the years is we really do need super sites. This would be cross-discipline super sites. And it would, because it's so difficult to work in the Arctic. So sharing the infrastructure, I think, would be very powerful. And I think you could integrate that type of a need with several of these other bullets that you have. I mean, I could imagine, I'm just saying this off the top of my head, I could imagine a super site near an indigenous community where you could have them work with scientists at these facilities. And the focus of the review article was on satellite data, so we didn't spend a lot of time talking about surface stations, but the satellite community absolutely needs surface observations to help interpret the satellite data and to validate it.
This is Michael. I would agree completely with that, and I would add to that that there's a huge importance of super site-like intensive efforts in the Central Arctic. Obviously, you can't build a super site in the Central Arctic, but I would underline the importance of major field campaigns for serving the purpose of ground truthing and also for interpretation of satellite data. I think my experience is that satellite data is really very powerful, but only if there is other data to support it. So by itself, it's not so powerful, at least, or maybe sometimes even dangerous.
Yeah, this is Will Ambrose. I would actually add that when I was working at NSF, this was one of the concepts that was floating both in the research community as well as among the administrators at NSF. So as someone just pointed out, this has been, O'Brien, this has been around for a while in a number of different guises, and it just hasn't gotten much traction. That said, there are, of course, we all know, sites across the Arctic, often around atmospheric observations where there are clusters of researchers and infrastructure. But this concept has clearly got a lot of room for improvement.
There is one thing you need to consider in particular for super site-like Arctic expeditions in the Central Arctic. So they are not sustained. They happen during a limited time period, and they're very often science-driven. And as a consequence of that, they may provide the best quality data you can find in that area, but the data management is usually not carried through in any organized or particularly good manner. And that's not because the scientists don't want to share the data. Well, sometimes scientists don't want to share data, but mostly I think it's because it's basically things that are demanded by the funding agencies, but done in such a way, unfunded, so that everyone does it in the cheapest and least productive way possible, just to fill the demands by the funding agencies, but not really in a way that it would benefit the entire society.
Great. So you can see I put that note under this shared variable concept. It seems like super sites are really kind of the perfect example of satisfying a whole range of kind of clustered observations.
I think that's really good.
Roberta, did you want to say something here?
No, I just like this discussion on the super sites, because I think that this is a nice or concrete possibility to a concrete method to prioritize. So prioritize measurements that serve super site, meaning will mean addressing very many users. The large possible number of users, because the measurements of the super site will be fully complementary and support a large range of applications. So that's an idea, super site instead of more diffuse efforts, concentrate the efforts on supersites, it's a guideline for optimization of the resources. Yeah, that's my comment.
All right. Do we have any other comments related to the first three on this list? All right, then let's look at kind of 4, 5, and 6 that are up on the screen right now. So we've just been discussing the super sites, which I think are a great model for moving these clustered observations forward. Any other comments here? It looks like Tetsuo had a few things to say in the chat box. Do you want to say those out loud?
Sorry, Alice. Can you say again? For the moment,
Yes.
I had a little noise background.
Yeah. Oh, would you like to explain what you were saying in the chat box out loud?
Oh, I mean you mean the first comment of mine?
Yes.
So yeah, so I agree to the number 5. The standardized idea, and so, but then it is. I agree that it is very difficult to standardize, but we can sometimes make the recommendation in case there exist some good examples before. I mean, in the past project. So I have some example for the from the permafrost projects. Some years ago, the people were trying to install the boreholes in many places, and they set a kind of standard or recommendation of the borehole settings with the devices and also the measurement depths. So we can, I mean, ask everybody to do by their own, but still, if we have recommendations, then the people are very easy to do so.
Yes, that is a great point. Should be clarified here. Any other comments related to this 4, 5, and 6? All right. How about this idea of so going into the roads process and how that's going to be implemented, expert panels. So looking at 7 and 8 on the screen at the moment. Any thoughts? Are expert panels the way to move forward? Disagreement with that? Crickets?
Cute.
Yes, our video list just got a lot cuter. All right, so the next point that came up during the call last night is that in order to get this started, there's a sense that it's important to start with defined defined societal benefit areas and applications, and that moving it forward is likely going to require a regional kind of shared area of interest. Is this a sense that the group of us on the call now have as well?
Well, it's Michael again. I got a comment to that. I think it might be smart to focus on regions where there is a particular interest and a particular need because of the particular need and the particular interest. But in many cases, observations are required for activities where the observations does not necessarily have to be in the region where the application is of interest or use. And I'm thinking of something along the lines of extreme weather, for instance. If you want to forecast, you need observations from the entire Panarctic region in order to serve a region. So, so that should not be forgotten. We should not focus exclusively on regions, but it would, in an applications kind of way of thinking, regions could be a good way to start.
Yes,
No,
and sorry, go ahead, Will.
It also depends on you know, the user group here. I mean, if you're shipping and you're going to ship across the Arctic Ocean, you know, regional is only going to get you started or finished, right? You need to have the whole picture, and you need to have it forecast out far enough in advance that you can set your shipping schedule. So I think it depends on, I mean, it could be local, regional, or pan-Arctic, depending on the, you know, on the user group.
But you could also frame it in different ways. You can have regionality and local as one focus, but you could also have a particular activity as a similar focus. It's not regional in space, but it's local in scope. And shipping would be such an example where you focus on an activity that does not necessarily occur just in one place, but it's a limited focus.
Yeah, right. Then you're back to, it was discussion, I can't remember when, where we were talking about, yeah, I forget the term we used, Alice, but different, yeah, you know, different groups are clearly going to have different needs at different temporal and spatial scales.
So much of the reason that part of the reason that the Bering Sea was proposed as an initial starting point was that there's a reasonably well organized indigenous community in the area. There's a lot of international presence, especially between the US, Canada, and then shipping coming out of East Asia. There are a lot of scientific projects in the region, and very rapid environmental change. So there is a pretty substantial group that would be ready and excited to start moving this forward in the Bering Sea region. It was mentioned that it might make sense to run the Barents Sea as a parallel kind of starting place. Do you guys have a sense that there would be a similar level of engagement with an effort spun up there?
Yeah, definitely. I work as much in the Barents Sea as I do in the Chukchi, and yeah, I mean, there's a equally robust international research group there. The indigenous communities, of course, are different, but there's indigenous communities that ring good parts of the Barents, at least the southern part of the Barents as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'd like to get into this question of regional versus kind of topical or thematic or sector starting points a little bit more. The idea with doing the regional focus initially was to then be able to cross sectors very naturally. Does that seem like a good reason to start there? Because as you mentioned, like shipping is going to cross regions very quickly. And so starting with a limited geographic area might not adequately capture that part of the Arctic observing user community.
So do we have to stick to one model, just only regional or just only topical? Couldn't we have just a couple of examples of each? And I think if you're going to start with regions, the Barings and the Barents are kind of obvious, I would say. But shipping is also an obvious sector which has a lot of activity and a lot of needs. I also want to come back to what I said earlier, that in the sense that there is a need for forecasting or prediction, as was mentioned in the first point, I think it was, or second, you need to supply measurements outside of the region to serve the region.
Yeah, and I don't think this is by any means limited to measurements occurring in the region. I think it's more an opportunity to build out some of these systems and some of the information networks that are proposed through this roads process on a more tractable scale.
Sorry.
I was just going to quickly say, you know, shipping is fine, but there's also the energy sector, minerals exploration. There's now that the Arctic is thawing, there are going to be a lot of people up there looking for business opportunities.
I could add fishing onto that. There's military interests. Yeah. Tourism, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's hard to choose one approach because it will also always take away some other things that may be of importance. So I think the energy that can be used, for instance, for a Barents Sea and Barents region is very welcome and also a good starting point. And if we have some other cross-cutting topical, then I think the combination would be good to start with.
Great. Go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly that you know, listing out these different industries and the military and so on would, I think, be in our best interest because it would probably support country buy-in. They'll be able to put up the funds, or they'll more likely put up the funds for any type of scientific research if there are economic opportunities or military opportunities.
Can I just quickly add fisheries and aquaculture to the list?
Anything else I'm missing here?
Some of those topical areas are also possibly regional and local at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think
there is no fisheries in the Central Arctic, for instance.
Yeah, I think the regional initial focus would necessarily cross sectors and include many of those areas. All right, so the next thing on our list was the idea that existing groups, specifically calling out CBMP, Indigenous observers and users, and then global programs like either Global Cryosphere Watch or GOOSE, and maybe we might need to tap one or two other groups, would be good places to start for setting up the expert panels and kind of the core structure to start moving towards these variable definitions. Any comments on tapping those existing expertise to move that forward?
Yeah,
well,
I think.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, I think that maybe adding PAIM into this part as well, because they're doing a lot on shipping. I think they just released one on shipping in the Central Arctic. The PAIME. PAIM.
Oh, sorry.
That's right. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, okay. Well, the only problem with that, and I mean, it's fine, but the only problem with, because those do have experts, is that it's a lot of the same people that have been doing this for decades, and we're trying to get young investigators involved. And, you know, Alice is an example of that, but, you know, you're retreading some of the same, you know, in large cases, old white guys like me doing this stuff. And it is not advancing things the way it could be if we get an infusion of, you know, new young blood. And there you know, it's Apex and other organizations out there with young investigators that can be drawn on. But I would encourage the group to think very broadly and start being sort of more inclusive than sort of going to these existing programs, which are being run by some of the same people in some cases for decades. And it's not to say that they're doing bad things. I'm not trying to criticize them. I just think we need some new, some new thoughts, some new blood, and another generation or two.
So why not mention Apex?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, it's Jari here. So it's really good that the goose is mentioned here, and in a positive first or second point also. But I would like to see a little bit more concrete suggestion or recommendations. Anyway, the goose itself, as I have pointed several times during the last days, that we don't have any Arctic goose, any official Arctic goose regional alliance. Other part of the seas have. So the one recommendation of what I would like to see that the AOS is giving to the Arctic Ministerial is that we have to establish, well, an Arctic goose. So it's just combining the existing regional networks to have a really it's not going to be a legal entity, but it would be something like a very strong open consortium. Because this is the really establishment of the Arctic goose is because of the lack of the political support.
Yeah, that is a good point that we can emphasize in this, that these, our starting point that there's a lot of good work being done really does hinge on the idea that there is good work being done also in the Arctic. And that's not always as much the case as we would like it to be.
I would agree with that, but I would suggest that the way to get around that problem is to work to engage these groups into Arctic issues rather than making a separate effort similar but just for the Arctic.
Harry, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course, there is nothing separate Arctic goose. If we can establish Arctic goose, it will be part of the goose. It's like all the goose is divided for the regional alliances, which are, more or less part of the global observing system. And, it's just a question of those nations, those people, those groups which have a mandate to operating in certain area of the global oceans. And that the example for us would be the Southern Ocean. During the last, I think, the 4 or 5 years, there has been a great advance in the Southern Ocean observing system. And so they just need to try to do the same for the Arctic Ocean domain would be really great.
Great. And then, so the last 2 points we had in our summary are these about opportunities for building engagement capacity in local communities, and then recognizing the challenges that disparate language and backgrounds produce in the process. Any comments on these?
This is Janet, and I apologize for coming into this a little bit late. I'm curious, and I should have looked this up last night, was this also a recommendation in the last one?
Which one?
Like last Arctic ministerial post ASSW list? I feel like it might have been, and I'm just wondering if that's I'm just, it's a question. I really don't know.
It's been a few months since I've read our last set of recommendations. I believe increasing local capacity in communities was mentioned in our ask, but without specific calls. What the one thing that's been floated with the Arctic Observing Summit Executive Committee as we're drafting this statement is the idea that the current COVID-19 crisis, by basically banning outside travel into many of these areas, kind of forces our hand to train up and pay community residents to take over some of the measurements and projects going on, and that if we can make a somewhat urgent call to the International Arctic Funders Forum, that this might be a way to start channeling some resources into what we've thought for a while would be a good thing to do, but haven't necessarily had the push or the impetus to start.
Yeah, I think that's really a great way to, I don't know if we should write it up with a little bit more of an emphasis like that, like given the experience that we've just had and the lessons that we've just learned from this, it becomes even more important to, you know, just to maybe reinforce it a little bit differently than whatever the last thing we said was.
Yeah.
And it's also, this is Brian Duncan, it's also not, for instance, just the COVID-19 crisis is the only reason. There's also financial reasons. It's expensive to fly scientists up to these sites. If the local people can do it, that just makes financial sense.
Yeah, there's so many great reasons, and I don't even mean to separate it out like that necessarily, but maybe just reinforce it in a way that makes it stand out is, I think, important, because I do think it's a great thing to make sure we get the point across in. However that is done, you know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of wordsmithing going on with the conference statement into making that point, and I think it's been something emphasized by a couple of the working groups, and so it is going to be one of our main recommendations for the Arctic Science Ministerial this year. Though recognizing that process, I believe ASM isn't until November, and so it's a slightly slow process on that. Any other comments here? All right, so that kind of got us through the key ideas part. Recommended actions that we can make. We've got asks to ASM and the Funders Forum. We have recommendations to spin up these regional kind of subsets of this Arctic observing system. We've got a number of recommendations going into the roads process. Are there any other actions or next steps that you guys see moving out of this? So one thing that was talked about in the call last night is that if we have these regional kind of either regional subgroups or a thematic project going. So the Arctic Observing Summit meeting takes place every other year, but it's possible to do in the off years a smaller intensive workshop kind of focusing on moving one aspect of this forward. Does that seem like a reasonable idea, or is everyone kind of at meeting fatigue?
I think Kaio's been talking about having to do stuff in the off years, or not just in the off years, but between the meetings. And despite the limitations of this virtual meeting, there's clearly a lot got accomplished, and one could easily envision having subsets of these groups meeting, periodically over the spanning time.
Yeah, and a lot of the challenge of the virtual meeting was planning it in 2.5 weeks. And I think if we had a little bit more spin up time, planning a virtual meeting is not super hard.
That's Anna. I brought up this idea yesterday, but I think I haven't actually communicated it very clearly, so I wanted to do it again. So I was referring to the Arctic Frontiers Abroad format, which is something that could be adopted in a way that we don't only have meetings for the ongoing projects, but also we have regional meetings to sort of engage with local people and build the capacity there. Because if we only meet once every other year, we work with the people who already know what's going on, and there are so many people who don't. So there might be meeting focused on actually explaining what is the roads and Arctic observing in the Arctic regions.
And I'm not familiar with those meetings. Is it more of a training focus, or is it trying to? I don't know how you would run that.
This is basically just bringing the pan-Arctic meetings to a regional scale, so people who wouldn't possibly be able to come to Arctic Frontiers, like communicating to them the ideas of the forum and like the key working groups and the topics. So something similar could be done. AOS abroad in Russia to talk specifically to people working in the Russian Arctic or Canadian Arctic or Scandinavian Arctic.
Are you volunteering to run one of those? I think we're the AOS organization is a dozen volunteers or so. So I don't know that we have capacity to plan more kind of overarching meetings. Sean, did you want to add what you just said in the out loud, or do you want me to read it out of the chat box?
No, I could just mention it. Thank you. I was just looking at the list and then reflecting on this past week. But one of the breakout sessions or work sessions talked about how predominantly male researchers there are, and also those, it's not only the researchers, but those who are on the International Arctic Council. And I don't see how the gender diversity is being addressed in these lists of recommendations. So I think it's really, if it was a study that was just recently done, I think we should at least address it and include it in the list. But I'm not sure where.
Yeah, the Arctic Observing Summit has a tendency to kind of entrain people into it and then not let them go. So it has, there are a lot of people who have been sticking around in the community for the decade or so that it's been going on. And certainly one of the things that comes out of that is that the numbers on gender diversity and diversity on a number of fronts can reflect where the community was at 10 years ago. From my perspective, having been looking and just scrolling through the list we've got right now, we're doing remarkably well on gender diversity, but I absolutely get your point that that's not necessarily reflected in the leadership and the especially at the ministerial and the Arctic System Science Week representatives.
Well, that was part of the point I was trying to make earlier. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you seem to have been muted.
No, I'm just saying that was the point I was trying to make earlier.
Yeah, I've been the sole remotely early career person on the executive committee, and I'm fairly junior, but I'm not a student or postdoc by any stretch, and so we really don't have, as an organization, there's been very little move to get early career researchers into the process. I think that's something that we have a lot of potential to expand, but also could really use some recommendations on how and where to move that forward.
Hi, Alice. Thinking about these workshops and about the limited resources that AOS has, there are ongoing activities in many projects, in many organizations, focusing on issue relevant for the AOS and focusing on the Arctic, and bringing together thematic experts in some discipline, in some field. So why not to utilize the ongoing activity so that to have a more direct link with the SEON goal, and so that I think both the international community and SEON would benefit from getting in line. But the international community would be very welcome SEON guideline on the roads as a way to carry out their activity in a more efficient way. So SEON could just have a role of sort of guidance and coordination, but not really organizing dedicated workshop, but just utilizing the already existing organization, the already established framework, where anyhow this themes, Arctic-focused themes, are advancing, and the same things discussed here in these days are brought forward.
Thanks, Roberta. Do you have any examples of a workshop like that we could that iOS and SEON could link to?
Well, I'm thinking at the Interos project meeting, or at the SIOS workshops. I know what's going on more in Europe, of course, but I suppose in US or Asia there may be comparable events. There are many discipline-focused workshops that address technological challenges in the Arctic, how to integrate measurements, and so on.
And for those, do you see a role for, people who have engaged and been interested in the AOS process, but who are not, already paid through Interos? Is there option for kind of public participation, or is it just that SEON should be guiding and kind of a presence in the Interos project meetings?
I would say both, definitely. Yes. So yes, there is an opportunity for direct participation, and or also just monitor or guidance support or like pre-contacts and exchange of views and guidelines, but also direct participation by SEON members who are not directly involved in the projects or in the consortia that organize the meetings or the workshops. Definitely.
But so direct participation by SEON, not necessarily just somebody else who's interested.
I think that has to be explored, but I think it's an opportunity to also optimize resources. Instead of dedicated workshop, ask the existing workshop organizer to expand a little bit the scope to better address the SEO needs. So yes, I think it has to be explored. I cannot promise, I cannot guarantee anything for any project, but I think it would be really beneficial for the project themselves. I'm thinking about Interos, and now there are not the coordinators here in the call, but I would say they would be glad to invite the people that would be relevant for SEON, and also focusing. We've spoken about early career scientists. That's also a priority for many of these projects and consortia. So that can be fulfilled too in this way. But also the inclusion of indigenous community. That's another priority that is shared with SEON and this consortia. So I would benefit from this overlap of interests, and so to optimize the resources so that we don't need to organize hundreds of workshops when there are already many ongoing.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Roberta. Gabrielle, did you want to say something here? How about Janet? Did you want to say something? I saw you unmuted yourself.
Oh, I did. I supported this yesterday because I felt like it was a way for us to work on something specific in the in-between years to make progress on, regional needs. But I guess now that I'm looking at it, I probably brought my own, like requirements to the table in my head, which was like, yeah, I would love to know a little bit more about what a bearing, needs would be, so I could do my thing and we could work on this. But I think we need to be more specific in what this would be. And I see that you've got linked to ongoing activities, but even that, I would encourage us to really think about what we would get out of something like this is, and not just, have support for it in a general sense, but support for it in a more specific sense. So if we were talking about understanding the bearing in a fully coupled, including biological or biogeochemistry way, in addition to ice, ocean, and atmosphere, what that observing system would look like. And we were discussing this based on the needs of the communities in that area. I think we could, you know, I'm not saying that's what it has to be, but if it were something more specific, it would feel more like something you could wrap your head around, and that's something you can make progress on. And that's just a, you know, a general comment that if we're going to suggest something, that's yet another workshop, whether we link it with something or not, I would need to know what it is first, and then decide how to approach it.
Yeah, and I know I think there was roughly 300 people registered either online or in person for the Arctic Observing Summit, and this would certainly be a subset who would be interested in whatever thematic or regional or whatever it is workshop that might happen. I think the question is really just like how much news and kind of linking to existing activities or leveraging existing activities should we be planning for in the intervening years?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think it's a great idea. And I guess my thought is that if we're going to have something that's a regional workshop, instead of figuring out who should we link, and I agree, we should absolutely, there's so many things going on. There's something out there that we can link to, and we should. But I would need to understand what that workshop would be trying to do or accomplish before I figured out who should we link to. Like maybe it's AOS, maybe it's, you know, who knows, Pat, I don't know. There's a lot of people out there. So that's my, like, I would love to wrap my head around that, and I would love to participate in it. And it would be better to define, if we're going to do regional observing system realizations, like even just something like that would be something I could wrap my head around, you know,
yeah,
based on community needs and gaps and how to fill them.
Great, thanks. So we can take this back to AOS Executive Committee and see what can happen and what's likely to happen.
Yeah.
Anna, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on the link to ongoing activities and ask a question. Does CEAN plan anything in relation to the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development? Because like this is a huge platform that could be used to coordinate efforts in Arctic observing. And I know that there was one regional Arctic meeting that was held in Tromsø earlier this year, and then another one planned in Copenhagen, which is now delayed. But has there been like anything beyond those two meetings, or is it worth investigating?
Sorry, I missed the first half of your question. My dog was standing on my foot.
Right, sorry, I'm talking about the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development and whether CEAN has any links with it, or should we consider it as a possible platform to coordinate efforts for Arctic observing?
I have no idea on that one. I have not CEAN. I don't tend to be at their meetings.
Okay, then I just wanted to bring it to everyone's attention because it is like a massive framework that could also be used in regards to the Arctic, and there is definitely at least 2 regional workshops that are happening and potentially more.
Did you say ocean science?
So it is called the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. I will send a link to the chat if someone is not familiar with it.
Because there's also other sciences.
This one is specifically for the ocean science.
Got it.
All right, great. Does anyone have any other thoughts on kind of off-year engagement? It looks like Tetsuo said in the chat box that it seems like Seon should take the lead for these next steps, and maybe make a list or suggestions for workshop themes and put a call out for that. But that seems to mostly match what we've been discussing. All right, that concludes our list of what we're supposed to accomplish with this discussion section. We have plenty of time, or we can have a bonus hour in our days. Does anybody have any other thoughts, comments that should go into working group 1's recommendations or notes moving forward?
Alice?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Tetsuo. At the beginning, you mentioned that for the AOS statement, you need to prioritize. I mean the topics.
Oh yes.
Yeah, I haven't get the idea how we do that during our discussion or.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for bringing that up. The two, or the things that were decided as the kind of priorities or key messages moving, just for the purposes of the statement, were this point number 2, that the Arctic observing system really exists to coordinate sharing of information, and that the next steps would be expert panels integrating indigenous community, and then that we think a regional starting point would be a good way to go. If this group has other things that you would like to see listed as a priority, now would be a great time to highlight that.
I think it wouldn't hurt to highlight the fact that there are other organizations, global, regional, or national, that we could collaborate with to get things done faster than doing it immediately. It's like an open invitation to all these other groups to collaborate with the Arctic science community. So I think that would be a good thing to put up. After all, collaboration has been a theme of the Arctic Council for several years now.
Yes, that's a great point. I believe actually that one is already how we open the draft paragraph in the statement. So thanks for calling that out.
Good.
Yuji?
Yes. Well, the prioritization, it's what for? I mean, and to the ASM or to the report to the SEON, or
So for the moment, we're kind of highlighting things that need to go into the ASM statement, and that all of this information here is going to go into our report to SEON, which does not have a page limit.
Okay, all right. I mean, the ASM1 is just they are kind of introducing the nation's Arctic research activities so that they can get know each other. But second ASM, they are talking about recommended actions, and then the ASM2 just leads to the support for the mosaic and EU funding for Arctic geos and those things. Or they pointed out that the inclusiveness of indigenous communities are very important, and those things are quite advanced by the ASM2. So, and also that ASM3 should suggest actions needed for Arctic science, and also better to suggest that what we have to implement quickly. I mean, rapidly. Those things. I mean, you know that ASM itself has to be advanced. You know, first to second, second to third. So we should suggest more implementations, just suggestion of the actions. So we have to think about that direction that the ministers are gathering just for the international corporations or collaborations. So we should suggest some so that they can easily agree to some implementations that we need for advancement of the Arctic research. So we should keep in mind that's a point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a great point. And that's certainly how we're framing the statement as we're putting together these pieces from the different working groups. But are there any particular actions that anyone thinks we should be including in this? Tetsuo?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure it really fits the topic, but so considering the current so COVID-19 situation, we need some actions to keep our existing observing system or running project whatsoever to keep them. So this is it's a rather short-term issue. I mean, as you mentioned for the regarding this number 11, we really need some action for that. That's a kind of a copy from the discussion in the working group during the SSW. So in the cryosphere working group, at least they're discussing quite intensively about how to cope with the situation.
Yes, yeah, and I think that certainly will be highlighted in the statement. And the other thing I do want to say very quickly about the statement is that we're putting together the initial draft, and then it will go out, I think, tomorrow for comment to everyone who is registered for AOS. So if you have additional comments on the statement that comes out on Friday, you'll have, I think, not quite a week to make any suggestions, and then we'll integrate those and put out a final version. Vera, it seems you unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something? Perhaps not. All right, does anybody have anything else to add at this point? All right, in that case, I would like to reiterate in the agenda document, I'm just going to go ahead and copy the link into the chat box right now. We have a comment box. If you have any other thoughts that at any point we should add to the notes for working group 1, feel free to either put them in there, or you can just email me. My email address is on every discussion document we've talked about, or in the chat box. I can make sure that those get integrated into our notes and our reporting for the working group. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your participation and your thoughts and ideas. I think this has been an extremely successful online version of the Arctic Observing Summit. So thanks for your patience with the platform and the time zones. And with that, I hope to see you all in the participant list for the closing session, and enjoy the extra 45 minutes of your day.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks, Anna. I saw that you, no, never mind. Great, thank you.
Do you need anything more from the Zoom tech? No?
I don't think so. Thanks.
Okay, all right, bye.